Launch Africa has 400 LPs from 45 countries, but the vast majority of the capital is from Europe. And we're very much focused in Fund 2 in bringing in African sovereign wealth funds and more African family offices. Launch Africa today, we have over 180 startup investments in 15 different tech verticals, 25 African markets.
Amazing having you on the podcast. We were just talking earlier, right? That's one of the perks of being a podcast host. You start having these off-record conversations, and suddenly these off-record conversations could be a podcast already by themselves. Tell me, you just grabbed yourself a little coffee, and there's actually more to it than just coffee. How does it relate to Africa?
Tobi, so great to be here. Thank you for inviting me. So when I was a small person growing up in New York City, one day my father came home from work and he said, "Okay, we are moving to Addis Ababa in Ethiopia." He had been recruited to be the head of the National Roads Agency. My mother said, "Time out, over my dead body. We're not moving to Ethiopia." It was during very difficult times in the country, but that sparked my curiosity about the country of origin for my favorite coffee. So fast forward many, many, many years when I eventually moved to South Africa in 2003. At that point, my dad was in the final years of his work for the Federal Aviation Authority, the FAA. And I said, "Dad, you have to come over to Ethiopia and explore the country where we would have lived." And he said, "That's your adventure." So Tobi, I did take that adventure. At that time, it was long before there was a technology and venture capital infrastructure in Africa. So I did many things in Africa, including freelance for the Financial Times, the FT. So I spent a month in Ethiopia with the different coffee families, and they have operations, across the country. But my frame of reference when I went to Ethiopia, I thought it was going to be like the Western Cape with the boutique vineyards and family-run businesses where it was very, high-end R&D and tightly controlled. There was only one coffee plantation on that model. The vast majority of Ethiopian coffee back in 2005, it was free range. And then there were, from the socialist era, community co-ops for drying the coffee and providing agricultural distribution information to the very smallholder farmers. But it really sparked my love of Ethiopia, appreciation for the incredible talent in that country. And it warms my heart now to see that they're actually starting to connect Ethiopia to the very robust East African entrepreneur system. So my expectation in 2026 to 2027 is Launch Africa will be in a position to invest in our first Ethiopian startup. One of the challenges for us as a institutional venture capital investor is we need to have a clear line of sight on the exit for this enterprise before we deploy $1 or $1 million into a company. So navigating exchange controls in Ethiopia has been an impediment for international VC flows, but very rich appreciation for the talent and for, like in Rwanda, the government clear vision for how the economy is going to develop. So there's, good support for startups in that country. So anyway, From my childhood Ethiopia coffee story to the present, a lot has happened between now and then.
it's great. I think there's a lot to unfold here in our podcast today, and you already mentioned a lot of exciting things. What you're currently working on with Launch Africa, I think there's a lot to discuss that's also relevant to me, but also the audience of Calendar, right? I'll be wondering. I mean, you just mentioned you were an editor of the FT, right? Covering the
No,
African
I was a
market,
contributor. Yeah,
a
I
contributor.
worked
Yeah,
freelance. Yeah.
yeah. So how did that actually happen, and how has it sort of helped you with what you're doing now? I mean, can you maybe reflect
Of
back
course,
to
Toby,
your to that and how that happened? Because
as a media
exactly, you were also a
entrepreneur.
part-time media
Yeah.
figure then, apparently, yeah.
Yeah. So wind back, earlier in my career, we were speaking earlier about my first chapter in Asia. So I was very fortunate to be in Asia just as the economy was really lifting off and they were experiencing phenomenal growth. So having served as for the Korean Minister of Finance in Seoul, when MasterCard International decided to set up an Asia Pacific headquarters in Singapore, they wanted that American women who had parachuted into the Korean Ministry of Finance, which is a very elite organization, highly respected, but not Korea is to this day, Korea and Japan are rather difficult for foreigners to navigate. So having spent a year on the inside and learning about how that machine works, I could be a valuable asset to MasterCard, not only in North Asia, but in that methodology of how do you build trust and understanding with local nationals? How do you get deep in the hearts and minds of people and understand, their vision and how they work and building the right trust networks and then layering the right financial capital, technology, and other support mechanisms to enable the regulatory leaders and then the commercial bank leaders to realize the national economic development vision, the corporate unique positioning within that wider context. So I was really fortunate at MasterCard to be embedded in China, India, Vietnam, to help build the local teams and to build connectivity between the local nationals, our regional headquarters in Singapore, and MasterCard global headquarters in New York. And so connect strategy, capital, technology, and build the case. So part of building the case was working with the FT, Bloomberg, Reuters, CNBC to tell the story of what we were doing in Asia, and how we were bringing, adapting technology solutions and product solutions to meet the local development priorities. So I had a really rich appreciation for these media assets. And when I found myself in South Africa, I think I just called up the bureau chief, who was a friend of a friend, and started pitching story ideas and then figured out how to navigate, the paper, especially the weekend paper. So I'd get to do a lot of profiles of CEOs. I certainly one of my most relevant profiles for this story is I interviewed Andrea Beaumart, who at the time was the first ever VC in Cape Town working for Hasso-Plattner Ventures. So way ahead of the market. And then Andrea went on to be an important partner in Knife Capital. And to this day, we remain business friends. She's in Berlin now with SoftBank Ventures. So that was a great example. But working for the FT, I literally could call any head of state or CEO and ask for an interview. And so that was while I was living in Johannesburg, I would travel, I mentioned Ethiopia. I'd travel to India to interview the CEO of Tata. I would go back to the US to do stories on South African technology entrepreneur, David Frankel, who then went up to set up the Founders Fund in Boston. So I would do a lot of cross-border work. But I felt very passionate about telling different African stories not just, the bad news stories, but stories about health and technology research, the wine industry, music industry, arts and culture. So it really gave me the opportunity to speak to leaders across all industry verticals. Super fun.
Mm-hmm. No, it's great. I mean, I'm sort of, I can relate, right? Sort of because I'm sort of also at that intersection of media and business and new media and what doors that opens up to get in touch with amazing people, hear their stories. So that's really something. So you've then almost a role model for me. I should learn a lot more how to sort of use media to get in touch with amazing people. That's so great. Margaret, I'm wondering. So your current top of mind is really Launch Africa. That's a big part of what you're doing, but there's also other things. And I'll be wondering, I mean, we could probably talk for the entire podcast about your background, what you've been doing. I mean, you just mentioned MasterCard, you mentioned your time in Korea, but I would be wondering, maybe share with us sort of what are the things from your background that one would need to know to better understand what you're currently doing? What's sort of the major milestones and what has shaped you a lot?
Yeah, Toby, I think, MasterCard certainly shaped me a lot, having worked both in Asia Pacific and then I moved to the US headquarters I built the new technology team. So working between New York, Silicon Valley, and Bangalore and helping to make sure that the MasterCard franchise banks were not disintermediated by the arrival of e-commerce and internet. So working together with Visa on secure e-commerce protocols. So it really built within me a clear understanding of corporate collaboration and distribution. And when it comes to mergers and acquisitions, the multi-layered decision-making that happens at corporate. How does a startup or scale up get acquired by a MasterCard or Visa? And it's not just what's on the spreadsheet, right? There's, again, back to trust, technology, chemistry of the entrepreneurs and their teams with the leadership of those potential acquiring organizations, realistic valuations, and then the corporate politics and, how that changes over time. So that MasterCard experience is so super valuable in Launch Africa's current focus on exits. And we'll talk a lot more about exits, which in our case means secondary sales of our equity positions and in the future trade sales that are appropriately valued for the companies. So my MasterCard background, super helpful and really gives me rich appreciation of our counterparties, working with our portfolio companies. The other experience that extremely influential in shaping my life as a board member, investor, is as an entrepreneur. So when I left MasterCard, together with a person who had been actually an advertising technology executive and a service provider to MasterCard. So Shobha Purushothaman was an incredibly effective video technology service provider for MasterCard. And we were talking about working with Bloomberg and Reuters and CNBC. They helped us they helped MasterCard executives access these media networks and to prepare the executives for those business TV interviews. But more importantly, they provided the video images to support the stories so that they became much more compelling. And in the late 1990s, early 2000s, video technology was emerging quickly. The company that became the News Market, I was the CEO and wrote the business plan, and it was all about working with the team in India to do compressed broadcast video so that it could be distributed over the internet to journalists at Reuters, CNBC, Bloomberg, and what we now call data analytics, tagging the video images so that with the eventualities that we were preparing companies for were airplane crashes, right? How do you control the media if you have a terrible news event. So having responsible footage about your safety procedures, and again, having a soundbite from the appropriate execs that was widely, universally available over the internet, and then tracking those downloads and providing the newsmakers in the corporate, both the corporate teams and their agencies, the analytics about which images were used by which media outlets so that they focused their content creation in a more targeted way. One of our early adopter clients was Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State. So that was incredibly fascinating to work with her team. And the news market, we really focused on the Fortune 50 companies to start with, again, sequencing the business sales process so that you had the market leaders endorsing the news market. We were really fortunate to have launched during the Sydney 2000 Olympics. So having left MasterCard, Visa was one of the Sydney Olympic sponsors and became part of our beta test, as did Coca-Cola. And it was the most fascinating time in Sydney because you had the IOC come in and try and shut down the news market because there was no internet rights at the Sydney 2000 Olympic Games. When the contracts were written, that wasn't really a possibility. So the Olympic sponsors said, IOC, out of here. We really want to test this emerging technology and enable us to get, our human interests and our business stories out in this new emerging channel. So it was a really incredible experience to build a team. The news market's headquarters was New York, but we quickly expanded from New York and London to Munich to Singapore and worked with, multinational corporations with whom we had previous relationships to adopt this emerging technology. We built the company very specifically for a trade sale to Reuters. We knew that this could be an asset that could be incredibly valuable to that entity. And then, again, talking about experiences that inform my current life as a VC investor and chairperson, during the course of building that and deepening that relationship, Thomson came in to buy Reuters. And of course, the CEO with whom we were working was not there to follow through. So it was a classic example of, working towards a trade sale and then having to pivot because that particular opportunity wasn't going to happen. So that totally informs, both the enterprise sales and the what does a good exit look like, and how to treat your team, having built a company organically across multiple markets. When we are working with our startup portfolio, I often try and look beyond the CEO to, the next layer down just to see what the level of talent and engagement is with those people because, they are the face of the company in many markets. So, I'm very blessed at Launch Africa. The two GPs, Zachariah George and Janaid Duplessis, are multi-fund managers. They have incredible quants, ex-Wall Street investment bankers. So we have very complementary skills. But when it comes to corporate collaboration and engineering trade sales, there's a lot of respect for my personal experience both at MasterCard and as an entrepreneur, and my passion for working with our startup portfolios to identify the right corporates where there might be vision alignment and the right product innovation at the right time. We still have a lot of work to do to get it to the right price.
Mm-hmm. And anything you could share about that pivot that you had to make early on that you mentioned? How did that pivot go on? Is there anything you could share?
Oh, it went on for a long time. So there wasn't another obvious, it wasn't like there was a same for same. So, and then what happened was so now we can talk about Africa. So I was in New York. it was great having spent 8 years in Asia to go back to New York at that exciting period of history. But my British husband, who I had met in Hong Kong, he was a Barclays investment banker. And although he grew up in the UK, he had a deep passion for Africa. He spent some of his best childhood holidays in Hermanus at the family beach house, his grandmother's beach house, and traveled in East Africa with his Oxford friend. So the first day we met in Hong Kong, he was talking about the African sunset. I was like, what are you talking about? We're in Hong Kong on the peak, an Asian economic miracle. He's like, wait till you go to Africa, you'll be a different person. So, I knew from early in this relationship that if we were going to stay together, Africa would be a part of our life. So in the early 2000s, John was offered the job to go and help reboot Barclays Africa Investment Bank. So we had to make the difficult decision to have a long distance relationship for a while. But I knew that I would need to move to Africa. So I'm back to the news market pivot. So I then moved to South Africa, and Shoba needed to manage that eventual trade sale. So it was a long journey.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Margaret, tell me about Launch Africa. You just mentioned, we just talked a bit about it. You mentioned also a bit about Launch Africa. Maybe bring me first closer into the fund. How does it work? I think you invest all across Africa. You're very unique, but tell me
Very
more.
unique.
How
So,
would I
and Toby,
how would I understand
because
Launch Africa?
I know you
Yeah.
are new to Calendar, so Calendar played an important role in Launch Africa's bridge building to Europe. So Launch Africa was launched in July 2020 during COVID. So all of the Fund 1 capital raising was done over Zoom. Hundreds, if not thousands of hours of Zoom calls with private individuals. So corporate execs, family offices, foundations, and venture capital and private equity partners. So our strongest base in Fund 1, we raised $36.3 million. We had started off with the $15 million target, but we had great buy-in. And it's very much private capital referring friends and family to Launch Africa once they saw the traction that we were getting. So today, Launch Africa has 400 LPs from 45 countries, but the vast majority of the capital is from Europe, Germany, Switzerland, France, the UK, and the Netherlands. And we're very much focused in Fund 2 in bringing in African sovereign wealth funds and more African family offices. Looking at, so Launch Africa today, we have over 180 startup investments in 15 different tech verticals, 25 African markets, and more than 18 of our North Africa companies have expanded into the GCC, so Saudi, UAE, and one into Qatar. So we're very much the Pan-African fund. The GPs live in Cape Town. We have team members across all regions of Africa and the Middle East, and our head of investments, is between London and Nigeria.
Tell me, I'll be very curious about also the sectors you invest in,
Sure.
right? You just mentioned Fund 1. I think Fund 1 was quite successful as well.
Yeah, well, Fund 1
my research,
was fully deployed. Yep. So
also related to that key metric DPI, and I think also for the audience, right? And I'm happy to get your input on it. Not even if you look at VCs more broadly, a lot of them struggle actually to return their funds. If you look at all VCs, right? So it's really also something that's not only unique to Africa, but it's just that's the game of venture capital, right?
That
So tell me a bit more about your
yeah.
sort of your fund, the investments you made in your first fund, the sectors, and yeah, also about how it's been going
Yeah.
as of right now.
Yep. So Fund One, 1.51 money on MOIC, very healthy top 2 quintiles. So the way with such a large portfolio, we segment it in quintiles in terms of the financial performance of the companies. And in Fund One, there was a huge focus on fintech. Um, we understood that you needed the digital payment rails for all sectors to enable proper automation of logistics, mobility, health tech, education technology, agri-tech. So, across all areas of Africa, ensuring not just payments, but treasury management, pension management, the on and off rails of remittances, right? So much of Africa's economies are built with money from the diaspora. So remittances is a huge part of, and making remittances affordable, convenient, and secure is an absolutely, mission critical economic development a priority. So Fund One, heavy focus on fintech. Fintech is the highest likelihood companies to have successful trade sales, whether it's to banks, bigger fintechs. So in Launch Africa, we were the first venture capital fund in Africa to have a head of exits. So Kartik Sharma, who was head of investments in Fund One, when we had fully deployed the capital, moved over to head of exits, having sourced these deals and knowing the founders quite intimately. Has been working with them since 2020 on helping them to secure follow-up investment from beyond Launch Africa, and now working with some of those follow-on investors, both venture capital and private equity funds, to sell secondaries of Launch Africa shares to those later stage funds or VC funds who are looking to expand their geographical reach in Africa. So packaging bundles of assets for those VC and private equity funds and dedicated secondary funds so that they can acquire access to some great de-risk companies at an attractive price. Going back to the beginning of Launch Africa Fund One, our goal was to get a small stake in some of the best early stage companies. So we're primarily a seed investor, and we are almost always the first institutional venture capital investor, with a lot of discipline on entry valuation. Founders are happy to give Launch Africa an attractive entry valuation because there's widespread recognition across Africa of the extraordinary post-investment support that Launch Africa has built. So that expands to access to talent. After money, access to affordable talent, the right talent at the right time at the right price is a critical element for a seed company to get to this Series A. Again, within 18 months to 24 months, that was our goal. So access to talent. We invested in HR tech companies to help the Launch Africa management team organize and provide affordable access to talent. Access to strategic partnerships with the big tech companies, AWS, Microsoft, Google, now Anthropic. So through Launch Africa's hefty aggregator, we are able to provide $1 million of credit to the startups, and we negotiate for technical due diligence and other support from the big tech companies. And again, in the future, we have active conversations with the M&A teams to also position some of the startups for scale-up support and, potentially acquisitions. And and then the incredibly rich and diverse LP network. So the founders are eager to work with Launch Africa because our LPs can co-invest, no fees, no carry, in the companies alongside us at these very attractive prices. So often in Launch Africa Fund 1, we had $17.5 million of LP co-investment. So collectively, we had well over 50 million. Some of our LPs will go and join the advisory board of the seed companies and perhaps double down in those companies and join the fiduciary board when the company reaches Series A. So we provide, disciplined access to some of the world's smartest investors, VC, private equity, corporate foundations. So it's, a very efficient community. Community is absolutely Launch Africa's unique value proposition, community of entrepreneurs and community of investors. The community of entrepreneurs, incredible peer network and connectivity. And it's really heartwarming to see there's a founder WhatsApp chat group, and founders will put out messages about hiring and expanding from market A to B, or working with enterprise clients, or looking for niche service providers, or trying to find out about IP lawyers. So there's a lot of support in the peer community. And when the founders go to regional and global events for investors in technology or in health tech, whatever their sector is, there's a natural community of other entrepreneurs that you can trust in the Launch Africa family. So it's really incredible that, post-financial support that's in the community. And in the community of investors, there's so much connectivity with Calendar because, when we meet with with the investors, we know Launch Africa is a small part of a big portfolio. So we try and connect them to values aligned, mission and mandate aligned investors, sometimes from the same geography, sometimes from other parts of the world. So there's a huge focus at Launch Africa in value addition and value creation and expanding both our founders and our investors' trust networks to enable and support their mission and their mandate.
Mhm. Yeah, I think Margaret, trust plays an important role, right, in what you do and building those networks. And I'll maybe ask one brief question about the venture system before, but I want to get back to the trust element because that's very important, as you really stressed it. I think one thing that I'll be wondering about, looking back, and I think you have very good oversight at what's happening in the venture ecosystem in Africa, I think, and maybe also elsewhere. So I'll be wondering, you just mentioned, right, Fund 1 was really focused also on fintech to build the infrastructure layer for all the other venture investments that could happen in other sectors. So that's really fundamental, if I understand it correctly. But tell me maybe what are sort of other sectors you're looking at? So you're saying that fintech has been really big or is quite big right now in Africa, a lot of successes. But what are sort of the other next sectors that are very exciting? Also, AI is a huge topic. How is AI going to affect and impact different sectors in the economy? And are we at a stage where sort of the infrastructure and the fundamentals of fintech is sort of the rails are done already to also start other companies and other sectors? Where do we stand there right now, and how? Maybe paint also a picture in different parts of Africa as well. That's a big question now, but maybe share with us a bit more about the ecosystem where we stand right now. That'd be wonderful.
So the fintech rails, continuous work is being done in collaboration with central banks, commercial banks, the telecom operators, right? Mobile money is an enormous part of the fintech ecosystem. One of the things that has been positively surprising in the Launch Africa as Fund 1 evolved was our ability to source incredible deals in Francophone West Africa. So we were the first, Anglophone fund to successfully source early deals in Francophone. We could do that because one of our investment committee members, Hannah Sabaya, was running Proparco, the French development finance based in Kinshasa. She is Congolese for Central Africa, and was helping to build out the network of deal sourcing up and down the Francophone coast. And for Fund 2, Hannah introduced Launch Africa to Lena Kasem, who now is our Abidjan-based head of Francophone Africa. And Lena grew up in Cameroon. Her family was very involved in the agricultural value chain. And so Lena has done a phenomenal job in building the connective tissue across Francophone Africa and working with Paris-based funders as well as local families and companies for distribution partnerships. So we see, Francophone was the last of the African regions to develop a very robust accelerator and connectivity. Francophone Africa is different than many of the other African regions in that there's a strong government involvement in the startup ecosystem. And it's really, again, encouraging because there's quite a lot of vision about how this can enable economic development in that part of Africa. In West Africa, we, saw Nigeria absolutely dominate venture capital funding. As someone who grew up in New York, when I started to work with Lagosians, I was like, wow, okay, Nigerians have that much more hustle than the average person in New York. Like, it's really, I think Nigerians are the most entrepreneurial people on the planet, and that transcends gender and socioeconomic status, rich and poor, men and women, urban and rural, is in the country DNA. So Nigeria has absorbed a lot of the venture capital funding. We're seeing Kenya and Egypt, also assert those technology centers. South Africa, which has, the longest built venture capital and entrepreneur systems, has the slowest rate of growth, right? Like, is well established. In my life in South Africa, as I said, I was, fully there by 2003 until 2020. I was super involved in Endeavor. So Endeavor, which is a global nonprofit that's very active in entrepreneur development and connecting startups to corporates and institutional investors. So many of my Endeavor venture mentor conversations with South African entrepreneurs were trying to talk them down from immediately expanding from South Africa to the UK and Australia, and let's scan the horizon north of Limpopo, and should you be considering an African expansion strategy, not just going to what you consider safe markets and, obviously margin-rich markets in the UK and Australia. So anyway, South Africa mature, slower growth, not as aggressive in terms of their Pan-African expansion. For me, when I joined Launch Africa as the chairman, my Endeavor colleagues had said, Margaret, when you move to London, please help to connect Egypt and sub-Saharan Africa. And as an American with Silicon Valley roots and now in London, there are many Egyptian successful technology entrepreneurs and investors, both in Silicon Valley, London, and in the Middle East. So, I was very intentional, even on Zoom, of meeting some of, the leaders in Cairo Angels, for example. So the angel networks in Egypt, and then meeting the corporate who were interested in partnering with startups, and Cairo University Accelerator. So again, finding the leaders and the stakeholders in Egypt to build those trust networks and to expand the Launch Africa investment mandate to North Africa. It was very much to capture one of the big four tech markets and to bring that collaboration and the peer connectivity with the entrepreneurs. And then what became clear was, Egyptian startups found it natural to expand to the Middle East, and there already had been, successful cases of startups scaling up in UAE, Saudi, Bahrain. So, and the institutional investors in the Middle East were very comfortable investing directly in North African startups. So when I moved to the UAE last year and started to spend much more time with family offices as well as the sovereign wealth funds and the hubs in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, it was helping to move beyond their comfort zone of investing and collaborating with North African companies and introducing the right sub-Saharan African companies into the Middle East ecosystem. Again, going back to the MasterCard mindset of how do you support the economic development priorities in each of these GCC areas. So, each country has their own Vision 2030. And, a very good example is Move, company from Nigeria that was the fintech infrastructure for Waymo and Uber. The CEO moved to Dubai at the invitation of, Dubai and UAE authorities because autonomous vehicles is essential national priority. And it was important to the GCC investors that they have a hub locally and contribute to the economic diversification of the economy. And from a Launch Africa and Counter perspective, to have world-class African entrepreneurs in the GCC helping to change the narrative about the quality and innovation and the ethical integrity of the founders is going to be really important to have successful distribution and collaboration. We shall see the timeline, but in Tobi, in Africa, when we're talking about realizations or exits, it's secondaries and trade sales. We don't typically talk about IPOs, but in my UK life, I work for an investment trust that's all about taking private companies public, both in London and in New York. And I'm certainly bringing that private to public mindset to my life in the Middle East and helping not just Launch Africa, but other investors think about what are the levers for ensuring a successful IPO, whether it's Dubai, Abu Dhabi, or Riyadh, and preparing these scale-up technology companies for a successful listing in the Middle East. So Launch Africa for years has been in active conversations with NASDAQ in New York and the London Stock Exchange, thinking about long-term pathways to IPO. I'm more bullish on the opportunities for a tiny number. If we're talking like 2 or 3 in the next 5 years, but there will be a couple of African companies that I think will have successful listings in the GCC. So that's an exciting development, but a lot of work needs to be done. And back to your media company, a big part of that is ensuring, analysts covering these technology companies, ensuring that there are appropriate comparable companies benchmarking that are already listed, from the Middle East. And then just the media, how do you communicate the stories around these companies and what they are doing to de-risk the future growth of the companies?
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, so I'm sort of a little podcast media nerd myself when it comes to things that are happening in the venture ecosystem or in entrepreneurial spaces. But what I notice is there's just so much about the US and Europe, but all the other markets are still a little underserved, right? There's still a big opportunity to educate people and show what's going on sort of elsewhere.
So much.
So that's,
And Tobi, I wanted to answer your question about new verticals. So climate tech and agri tech are 2 areas that have in Fund 2 attracted, very considerable venture capital investment. For the Counter podcast community, there's a Substack feed called Africa, the Big Deal, which reports on all of the numbers of venture capital raised and deployed and exits. So it's a really important, third party analysis as to what's happening. And the big deal reports Launch Africa is not unique in investing in climate tech and agri tech. A shift in the past 18 months has been a lot more focus on debt. It's not debt and equity. So Launch Africa is only an equity investor at this moment in time, but there's a lot more debt instruments being used in early stage companies in Africa. And that provides opportunities for new players from Europe and the Middle East to partner with African operators to expand, debt and other facilities to these companies, but having appropriate and trustworthy data about the performance of the companies is absolutely mission critical for that successful rollout of new products. Part of Launch Africa's move to focus on climate tech was very much inspired by our European LPs. It was in their investment mandate to focus on climate tech. And they see, Africa as the fastest growing population on the planet and fastest growing business ecosystem, to ensure that responsible technology was being used to reduce carbon emissions, right? Carbon emissions in Africa is very small compared to the rest of the world because of the lower level of industrialization. One of the climate tech companies that I'm been following closely is Octavia Carbon in Kenya. So a direct air capture company based in Nairobi, and very much a pillar of the Kenyan green economy machine, creating jobs in the green economy. Expensive asset, totally using the geothermal engineering available on the Rift Valley in Kenya. But when Launch Africa, our deals are sourced through entrepreneurs. So we have found some of the best companies to invest in through our current founders, and then also the CEOs of bigger tech companies like Flutterwave and Paystack and MoneyPoint. They will recommend companies that they are already using in their value chain gaps. So that's good news. But we also get excellent recommendations from our LPs. So Octavia, we have a Dutch investor who spends a couple months each year on the ground in Africa, and he was already buying into Octavia. And when I saw it, I took it to both climate change scientist friend at Oxford and people we knew at BP and Shell Ventures to see whether this was an asset that might be a trade sale in the future, and absolutely got validation that the engineering was such that it could be attractive to these companies. So Octavia is certainly one of the climate tech companies for Counter Community to watch. It's benefited from a lot of press coverage, both in The Economist and in like MIT, so quite interesting. And the only asset like this in Africa. Before we recorded, we were talking about working with the Munich startup community. So there's a company in Ghana, Accra, Ghana, Wahoo Mobility. So female founder, she worked closely with a CTO in Munich. There was quite a number of German investors in the angel and pre-seed rounds in Wahoo Mobility. And it's taking world-class manufacturing of e-vehicles to Ghana, Accra, and then embedding within that the e-mobility movement, the fintech for the logistics and mobility services. So employing drivers and providing vehicle financing for drivers and affordable transport and logistics for businesses and consumers in Ghana. So interesting company. And these days, a lot of kind of fusion of climate tech, green tech, and agri tech. So we're seeing a lot of deals in those sectors across all of Africa. I think in the early 2020s, agri-tech was very much focused, like it was Kenya was the heart and soul of agri-tech. In the Launch Africa portfolio, Complete Pharma in Ghana was one of our star performers in Fund 1. And we were able to get a very attractive exit in Complete Pharma in recent months. So there's been, a lot of both impact and institutional investors crowding into Complete Pharma, which is the digitization of inputs and then offtakes for agriculture in West Africa. So I'm really excited about agri-tech, and certainly I was in the US for the month of June, and it was really encouraging to get agri-tech investors and market leaders welcoming me, as for access to African markets deals, stakeholders. So I think in the US, as you were saying earlier, completely gripped by AI mania. The vast majority of VC investors and fund managers, all they can talk about in the US is AI and defense tech. But it was the agri-tech and fintech investors and operators that said, come over here. We want an update as to what are the opportunities in Africa and how can we collaborate. So really excited about that. And sitting part of the year in the Middle East, food security is such a big, priority for leaders, business leaders, and government leaders. So Africa is an essential part of their food security strategy. And, as I've gotten to know some of the sovereigns and family offices in the Middle East, their first two questions are, can you help me to find the best primary agriculture deals? And the second is access to African data center deals, because, the governments in the UAE and Saudi have invested heavily in their own AI models, and they see collaboration with Africa, both in mining, health, education, is really important for helping to get appropriate use cases for their AI models. So, in Africa, we're also seeing Chinese government and private companies looking at partnerships in Africa to train young people in their AI tools and thinking about use cases, uh, health, education, access to critical minerals. So there is a bit of an arms race in Africa as to who's going to partner with which AI infrastructure players.
Yep.
And Toby, for your audience, I think it's super important to understand Africa has 1% of the data centers, right? Like it's insane mismatch of growing population and lack of access to technical resources. So we're encouraged that the big tech players, when they said Google, $1 billion to reach Africa, a lot of that was in the technical infrastructure with data centers and connectivity. And in addition to Launch Africa and Chrysalis Investments Limited, the UK Investment Trust, and 535, the Women Gender Lens Investor in Africa, I teach at London Business School and a private equity masterclass. And for me, it's just such a great discussion with private equity investors and family offices and sovereign wealth funds from Europe and the Middle East, as well as Asia and the US. And so I get a lot of inputs about who's doing what in the data center universe and providing, follow-up discussions about how can these global players ethically access deals and partnerships in Africa. So, I think this tiny percentage of African data centers, we will see a significant uptick, but it requires, a lot of capital and commitment from governments to provide security of these assets.
Yeah, Margaret, thank you very much for sharing also that overview of what's happening in Africa, also beyond fintech. I think We could probably do a podcast about each vertical. That's so fascinating, but I think it's worth it to give, the audience an overview. What is actually happening? All of these insights that you're getting from very different sides. I'm just wondering, another question, about the network, right? Your mission of building these trusted networks, trusted connections, that is also very well aligned with what we're doing, right? And I'll be
Absolutely.
wondering, you just mentioned, right? You were in these Zoom calls when raising Fund One, connecting with all these LPs. Now you have, I think, 400 LPs. I'm not sure,
400
or
LPs.
multiple
Yep.
from very
400.
different backgrounds. 400. How do you, what's their perspective on Africa, or what are sort of misconceptions that they might have about Africa and whether Africa is an attractive place to invest in? What have you experienced now in the last years talking to all these LPs who are interested in deploying capital but not sure whether they should deploy it in Africa or not?
Sure. No, thank you. That's absolutely right on target. So, Tobi, Launch Africa Fund One's anchor investor was Commerce Venture. So, right, a corporate venture capital institutional investor from Europe that was looking to adapt their know-how about fintech and insurtech to later stage African companies. And they saw Launch Africa as pipeline. Commerce Ventures typically invest at Series C or D, big player in Money Point. So that was interesting. There was a lot of rigorous due diligence. Commerce Venture is very much a financial return on investment investor. The majority of Launch Africa's investors in Europe wrote the check, and so our minimum ticket size for an individual is 100,000 US. For a family office, 500,000, institutional, $1 million. So people were writing for them relatively small tickets out of their impact bucket, and not expecting, we're all about creating liquidity. We want to 3x your money over 7 to 9 years. So very focused on moving the conversation from impact investing to commercial returns on investment. But, I've gotten to know, since I spend a lot of time with our LPs all over the world, including Europe, that we were very much out of the impact bucket. And because we consistently go back to report to our investors every 6 weeks about the progress of our funds, and we have twice a year very detailed financial reports. So we are incredibly transparent about what's working, what's not, and why, and how can you help? So we are very, again, specific and intentional in our communication with our investors, both written, in person, and online, and asking for help to how can they unlock, both their expert knowledge, whether it's an investment or technical domain, and access to customers like enterprise customers or tech customers for portfolio companies. And I'm constantly sitting down with our LPs to map out trade sale strategies for some of our assets. And, one of my favorite investors in Berlin had a very significant trade sale to SAP of his company. And liquidity he achieved through that trade sale enabled him to become quite an active investor in his own right. So we're, tapping into his personal experience and his professional credibility, especially with SAP, to say, what are the next steps we need to take to build trust with that corporate and to line up the right portfolio companies with the right business unit at the right time to ensure a successful collaboration. So we're, for those LPs who wish to roll up their sleeves, they are finding that they can provide significant financial value beyond their capital. I think for them, it also becomes much richer an experience if they're able to visit Africa. So it could be anywhere in Africa, because Launch Africa has a presence in 25 African markets. But we're finding our LPs love to come to Cape Town because it is the easiest place to start. And as you know, with the Counter Conference at the end of January, the mining in Daba at the beginning of February, Launch Africa, in the last few years, has had its annual general meeting and an investor immersion in the middle of February. So there's a concentration of events in the first quarter of the year where investors can easily come on, to Cape Town to start to meet other investors and entrepreneurs and stakeholders. And then, we often try and help them go to other African markets to see for themselves the magic of the entrepreneurs solving real world problems across all these different verticals, as we were saying: agri-tech, climate tech, ed tech, health tech, logistics and mobility, and AI. So, I think for those investors who can afford the time and commit the time, the market experiences the magic, and then the wake up that actually there's money to be made. Africa offers both profits and purpose, and depending on where they sit, they can act on that information, whether it's in their own company, in their family office, or just in their network, helping, big and small companies understand there's money to be made in Africa, and the talent from Africa can be world class. So, Tobi, a big part of my time in Europe is helping European companies, both Mittelstand in Germany, the family-owned businesses, multinationals, and tech companies, small, medium, and big, understand if they are looking for affordable and world-class technical and commercial talent. Launch Africa has portfolio companies to provide them access to this talent. And building those bridges, again, starting with trust, that, so I'll give you an example. One of the Launch Africa HR tech companies is called Africa. Sam Emmanuel, the CEO, has been to Germany with me for the last 2 years, full circle with Calendar. So on the first German road trip that Launch Africa did in Germany, Mikael and Oliver from Calendar helped us to set up meetings across all of Germany. One of those meetings was at the high-tech Gründerfort HGG Family Day. Alex von Frankenberg, who was the MD of HGG, invited me to participate in the conference. It was absolutely mind-blowing. He had said on the phone when we spoke on Zoom, Launch Africa, the ecosystem building that you're doing is exactly like HGG, except Launch Africa doesn't have the active government, financial, and strategic support that HGG has, but bringing startups, investors, and corporates together is very similar, HGG and Launch Africa. So anyway, it was really great that Calendar was so instrumental in getting us embedded into this really important German network. The happy story with Semicolon. So in my third year of going to HGG, Semicolon came. We got them to meet the head of Bosch Innovation to begin a due diligence there. SAP is very involved in HGG. We're, again, trying to engineer for Semicolon to get into the right distribution channels at SAP in Europe. In the meanwhile, SAP came to Semicolon in Nigeria with a request to train, how do we train more Africans in the SAP tools? So we're seeing the African talent for the world manifest through this company, Semicolon, which is founded by a technologist who worked in European private equity for Man Group and worked for Oracle in Silicon Valley. So, world-class African talent, training world-class African talent today in Nigeria, and having off-take agreements with corporates, especially telcos, banks, and tech companies in Nigeria, and increasingly in Germany. So very exciting, but it's hand selling these talent solutions in the short term to build trust and momentum. We have another HR tech company, AFG, African Foresight Group, started by a Berliner of African descent. And Yasmin moved from Berlin to Accra in Ghana, and spent a lot of time in Lagos and now is in Johannesburg. And she works very closely with German Development, who have helped to fund the curriculum for AFG, again, to develop African talent. AFG model is Africans for Africa, so very much focused on African conglomerates and family-owned businesses and helping them access both technical and commercial talent in an efficient and cost-effective way. And they have a really fabulous African champion program. So different models on the whole African talent for the world, but it's really exciting. And with Africa being such a fast-growing population, formal jobs constitute less than 10% of the opportunity set for people coming into the workforce in Africa every year, right? So there's so much need to create companies and to do so with private capital because still finance has dried up, right? So Launch Africa, really right time, right solution in terms of banking private capital and distributing it to high potential early stage private companies. But the flywheel of those companies growing from small to medium to big will only work if we have the appropriate collaboration with big and small companies, both in Africa and more broadly in the world.
Great. Hey, thank you for sharing all these anecdotes as well. I think that makes it very tangible and also very valuable for the audience. Margaret, I think we're coming to an end here in terms of time, but maybe one question, since I know that that's also very dear to you. You just mentioned Launch Africa as a great example of how, or you guys demonstrate that it's also possible to make returns in Africa, but still the impact part is a very, very big part of your life and your job. Tell me all about impact. I mean, we're talking about philanthropy as well, that seems to be something you're interested in, and also, your work at another venture fund where you actually support and encourage female entrepreneurs to build things. Tell me, maybe finally, what is sort of top of mind in terms of impact for you, in addition to all the venture things going on, or complementary to your venture work.
Yeah, Tobi. So, again, I'm so proud of Launch Africa for delivering 7% DPI in year 6 of our Vintage 2020 fund. So that's on parallel with US quintile 1, top performing VCs. And there's a scarcity of that DPI in the majority of VC funds around the world. So super proud of that. I'm also super proud of, in Launch Africa, having 20% of the co-founders in our cohorts be women. So we're very intentional about finding the best women-led businesses on the continent, because they are often very attractive valuations and they're going to work harder and smarter. So I personally, as a former female founder who benefited from the first ever cohort of Women Accelerator and Women Investment in New York back in Internet 1.0, when Hema Valba from 535 Ventures, so a female focus, also seed investor fund, asked me to join the organization on the investment committee, I absolutely rolled up my sleeve to say, okay, how can we get female investors and female founders from around the world to become investors in 535 and offer their access to networks and technical support to 535. So really excited about the community of investors at 535, sensational investors and entrepreneurs as LPs, and then labor of love to help the team navigate the twists and turns to get MasterCard Foundation. So MasterCard Foundation is completely separate to MasterCard Corporate, but when MasterCard had its IPO, the foundation was set up specifically mandated to support African job creation and to work through partnerships with funds and nonprofits to create entrepreneurship development across the continent. So MasterCard Foundation is now the anchor investor in 535, and that feels like it's on the right path to having appropriate capital to invest in Africa's best female founders. I was chatting to Hema about the 535 portfolio, and she said that the single best performing asset today is Bupas. So a Kenyan-based company that just is described as like Expedia meets Stripe. So it's the booking infrastructure and payment infrastructure for intercity bus, train, and plane movements across Africa. So as you will discover, Tobi, traveling around Africa is complicated, right? For many people flying, you have to fly through either Ethiopia Airlines or through the Middle East or through Europe to get within Africa. So transport and logistics are complicated. Bupas simplifies the process for rich and poor people to find the best travel deals and to book it. And then obviously building the data infrastructure around secure, affordable travel for Africans. So super excited about Bupas. In the Launch Africa portfolio, really good story about a female founder who comes from the rocket internet world. So Emma Heap set up Sudor based in Cape Town, taking advantage of the world-class technology and commercial talent in Cape Town, but building a company that serves 200 businesses across Africa, Europe, South America, Brazil, and they've set up a head office for North America in Mexico. Again, very capital efficient way to access North American market. So Emma is an example. Launch Africa, more than 90% of the founders we invest in are African. We have a handful of Europeans and Americans who've moved to Africa, who we also invest in because they are hiring and building, world-beating companies with African talent. But it's a great model. It's obviously higher margin to sell their products and services in Europe and North America than in Africa. So super excited about supporting the next generation of female entrepreneurs and connecting them to markets and follow-on investors. Tobi, it's really frustrating that the percentage of VC allocation to women in Africa overall is low as it is in the rest of the world. So, this is certainly something that I see for the rest of my career, being involved in supporting female founders, both of big and small companies. In my UK life, I joined Chrysalis Investment Trust primarily because I was super interested in Starling Bank. So one of the biggest challenger banks, digital challenger banks in the UK. And at the time, Anne Bowden, the founder, wrote, books and was very active in podcasts and in global media about the trials and tribulations of being a female founder with 15 years of tier one banking experience in the UK and Ireland. So I was really interested in not only her as a female founder, but building an incredible digital bank with really excellent banking as a service engine product that I knew I could help Engine figure out its strategy for North America and the Middle East and Europe. So it's been really exciting to work with female founders and investors all over the world. It still is. It's a big part of my personal passion. So for your audience, happy to have inbound on LinkedIn, for female founders and investors looking to connect and compare notes and provide access to deals and support networks.
Great. Margaret, thank you so much for taking the time today. It was wonderful talking to you and learning more about the African ecosystem, about venture in Africa, and all the impactful things that that are currently work in progress all across Africa and beyond that. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it, Tobi.